Alright, tip number 3, capture versus bubbling. So if you have been working in Google Tag Manager for a while, you have probably tried out our built-in click triggers, the all elements and the just links trigger. And you probably know the difference between those are that all elements would actually capture all the different clicks on the page, and just links does this specifically for links. But there's actually another crucial difference between those two triggers. Let's have a look. So right now we have the just links trigger activated, and when we reload our page, we can actually see the different listeners that have been deployed on our website in our developer tools. So let's open them up, go to elements here, and we can see our event listeners that have been deployed. Now we are specifically looking at the click listener, and we want to look at the one that has been deployed by GTM. So first of all, we see that the click listener has been deployed on the top level of the document, and it doesn't use something called capture. Now this is the attribute that I'm actually talking about, because the crucial difference is that the link click listener uses bubbling, and the all elements click trigger. So let's go to all elements, save this, refresh this, and go back to our event listeners. Right here, we see that the all elements trigger actually uses the capture attribute. What does that mean in particular? Well, if you go back to this page, it's all explained here on the side point page. So if you want to read through this and get more detail on it, then I'm going to link that up down below. But this diagram really shows it well. And the event propagation after the actual element has been clicked has two phases. One is the capture phase, and then there is the bubbling phase. If you attach a click listener to the top level here, in our case it would be document, the event listener would register the click and travel down the document until it hits the point that you have clicked on, and then sends that signal back to your event listener that this was clicked on. But there's also something called the bubbling phase, which happens after the capture phase is over. The event propagation, so the signal that actually informs that this was clicked, then travels upwards until it hits again the document node, which will inform the listener that this has been clicked on. Now the crucial difference between those is that the capture phase doesn't care about any kind of conflicting JavaScript. The bubbling phase could stop the propagation. So if you have any kind of other scripts installed that actually listen to events on the page, which is oftentimes the case as we see it on this page right here, then it might be that your event wouldn't bubble up correctly, and therefore it would be stopped and wouldn't reach our event listener, which is attached on the document node. And that's one of the reasons why oftentimes the link click listener doesn't work as well as the all elements listener. And therefore I would recommend that if you have tried out the link click listener and it doesn't work, you go back to the all elements listener and try to select the right element with this particular trigger in order to capture your event correctly. All right, tip number 4, a custom listener. Now we have seen that we have all these click listeners deployed on the document node. That means they need to travel down or bubble up in order for our listener to get noticed. Now this is a very economic way of doing things, because if you want to install multiple click triggers that listen to different interactions on the page, then we only have to deploy a listener once and can define different filters for our triggers. So Google Tag Manager is pretty economical in this way. But what if the built-in click triggers don't work at all? Then you can resort to something called custom listeners. And custom listeners is nothing else than a little bit of JavaScript that deploys a listener functionality on your page. We do this anyways already with the click trigger on our page, but with a little bit of JavaScript, and I will link this up down below, you will be able to build your own custom listeners that have the big advantage that they don't get attached to the document node, for example, so they are not dependent on capturing and bubbling, but rather on a specific node that you choose beforehand, and that would be done through a query selector. So for example, here I want to listen to the add to cart click. I implement the click event listener, and then I give the argument of a function what should happen once the event is detected, where I want to push data to the data layer. And here we use an event key, but also the keys that are already inside of Google Tag Manager, so we can use our variables like the click element or click URL. Tip number 4, a custom listener. Now you might be aware that you have a lot of different trigger types to your disposal. We can listen to the page load, we can listen to clicks, user engagements, and other events that Google Tag Manager predefines and builds a trigger for us in order to listen for these events. But the browser actually has more events available. So if you go here to the MDN resource, we can see there are many different events from before unload, so before the window actually closes, to CSS animations, form events like reset and submit. Well, submit is already inside of Google Tag Manager, but the reset not yet. You have cut, copy, paste. All of these interactions are actually something that you can listen to if you deploy a little bit of JavaScript. And you can obviously deploy such a listener through Google Tag Manager itself. So if you build a little script, for example, this one here, you simply tell JavaScript to attach a event listener to a certain document node. Then it will listen for a specific event. In that case, you can enter any kind of event you see in this list here. For example, click, scroll, key down, and so on. I've chosen to try out the context menu here, which is basically the right click on an element. And then you can also choose if you want to use the capture feature or the bubbling feature. So set this to true if you want to use capture. And then these few lines of code will attach your event listener to a certain node. And if that event happens, it will push information into the data layer so we can use it with Google Tag Manager. Now to try this all out, I have actually built a trigger here that deploys this on DOM ready, as we need to have the actual element loaded in the browser, and DOM ready is the right event to do this. So let's try this out, refresh and refresh our page here. And we attach this to the add to cart button. So I'm going to right click, and you see there's a new event that popped up in the preview mode, the context menu. Let's inspect this a little further. We have context menu here. This was the data that was pushed into the data layer. And as we are using the right naming conventions here with GTM element ID and classes, these will also be pushed into our click classes, click element, click ID, and so on. No, not all information is being pulled. That's normal for these event listeners, but you can work with the text that you actually have available here. Now, if you take a closer look at this event listener, again in our developer tools here, go to elements, and then we look at our event listener, we can't really find our context menu in this list. And that's because it's not really attached to the document node. It's attached to the single element that we selected. So let's go down here and inspect this element. Now this is in focus, and we should see our context menu listener attached only to that button that we see here. And that's more specific than what you do with the click trigger, for example, as you can choose a single element to be targeted instead of basing this on rules within the trigger itself. Now, obviously, once you have the data in the data layer like we have it here, you can build a trigger of that and fire an event, for example, to Google Analytics. So custom event listeners are really a great way to track interactions that Google Tag Manager doesn't have a trigger for yet. I'm going to link up this little JavaScript down below. Tip number 5, custom utility functions. Now you might be aware that if you build a new custom JavaScript variable, you can enter some JavaScript that will be executed once the variable is called. An easy example of that would be just an anonymous function, which would return a value like our string test. Let's save this all. And let's have a look in our preview and debug mode. And as we can see, our custom JavaScript utility function now returns the string test. Now, a custom JavaScript variable most of the times returns a value like a string or a boolean or a number, But what it can also return is an actual function. Now, you would need to rebuild the variable to return a function which then would be executed. So for example, let's go back in our utility function, and instead of returning a value, it would return another function. Now you can enter an anonymous function here that should take an input. So for example, we put an input here and say, please then return that input. What that lets us do is, if we use this custom JavaScript variable in a tag, so for example, let's go with our custom HTML here, and let's call this variable. And then in parentheses at the back, we'll put in our input. So for example, test. It will use that input, put it into our function, execute it, put this into our variable test, and then log that out. Well, maybe we could just use an alert here. Don't do this in a real life scenario because you don't want to have alerts popping up on your page. I will just do this for now. So wrong trigger is attached. Let's go with the all pages trigger. Refresh this. Go back to our page. And we can see our test string that we had entered into this custom HTML is now popping up. And we can keep that very dynamic. Enter whatever we want into this function, and it will be used as an argument and then used into our tag deployment. Now, how can this be actually useful? So if you have an input in your tags that you want to dynamically replace in your custom JavaScript variables, you can now do that with this functionality. You might remember a video we done a while back on transforming the data layer. I will link that up down below as well. And in this video, we transformed the data layer that we would encounter on a checkout page, on an order received page, because there's data information that gets transferred into our enhanced e-commerce tracking object. So we have here our data, but some tools such as the Facebook pixel would like to have this in a different format. So what we would have done is build a custom JavaScript variable right here and accessed our e-commerce data layer, then transformed it into an array. So the output would actually entail that we would have our product IDs in an array right here. Now this works fine, but it needs to have the actual purchase page in front of it so it can access the right data layer. What if we wanted to make this a little bit more dynamic in terms of what page this variable actually runs on? So for example, if I wanted to have the same product IDs variable, having that execute also on a category page where we also have our data layer push with a lot of impressions, but when we look into our variables, it wouldn't work anymore because this only works on the purchase page. So let's make this a little bit more dynamic. First of all, let's rewrite this. I'm gonna get rid of the try catch error here. And instead of returning our product IDs, I'm gonna return a function. And in this function, I'm gonna pass in the actual data layer key, And inside of this function, we're gonna do exactly the same. We're gonna open up a variable, but this time we're simply gonna try to access our data layer key. Let's get rid of this and type in data layer key. So the argument from up here would be passed down here. Once we have that done, we can proceed with our normal operation of opening up a new array, going through these different products and pushing the ID of the products. And then in the end, we want to return the value of the product IDs. Just like up here, I'm going to get rid of this. So again, this returns a function that takes up a data layer key, goes through the products in there and pulls out the ID and then returns the product IDs. Let's try this out. Let's save this and execute this first of all. So we would need to have our custom HTML tag, and we'll go again with our products ID to array, but in parentheses we'll put in the right data layer key. In our case, we would be on a category page where there is a data layer and we need to access e-commerce.impressions. E-commerce.impressions. And then we'll alert this right away Let's unpause this tag, save it, and refresh. We have a problem here. Let me just see. All right, I just forgot to enter here a semicolon. That should do it now. Let's refresh our preview and debug mode and go to our category page. And we now see that this information was returned from all the products that are on this page in an array form. Let's check this again. We have now a product ID. This is a custom JavaScript. It's a function, so we can't really see what is going on inside, but it returns our array as we have seen in the alert. Now you need to use them obviously in conjunctions with custom HTML tags. Another example of how this can be useful, Simo Ahava has written a custom JavaScript variable to set cookies. So it takes as an input name, value, milliseconds, path, and domain. And if you don't enter the milliseconds for the cookie, then it will expire when the session ends. If you don't put in the path will be simply empty. And if you don't put the domain that you're probably on right now. So let's see the domain if the cookie unset defaults to current domain. So let's try this out. I have already installed this variable right here, set cookie variable. And in our custom HTML tag, just got rid of this. Oops. Set cookie. Now the first argument would be the name of the cookie, then the value, then the milliseconds. Let's just keep this empty, and also the domain. Let's keep this empty and just try this out. Refresh our page here. So that should execute in the background, and we could see that in our developer tools under the application, and then here we can see our cookies that are installed on our domain. And here we should see our new cookie called cookie name and the value of 5. So really something that makes the tag deployment easier and faster, because we'll be able to use dynamic values inside of custom HTML variables and custom HTML tags and make the whole process more dynamic.
Alright, so there you have it. I consider these advanced tips. I didn't know them probably a year ago, and it has really been a passion of mine to understand Google Tag Manager more in depth, the JavaScript that lays beneath the actual tool, the interface that we see in Google Tag Manager, and to utilize it more efficiently. So I hope with these tips you can do that too. If you have an advanced tip that you would have liked to see in this video, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave us a comment down below. And if you haven't yet, then consider subscribing to this channel and maybe also check out this video, which is pretty interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one. My name is Julian. Till next time.